Hello, I'm Boban Dedović, and this is episode 8 of the What We Talk About When We Talk About Mind podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Lisa Derr. She completed her doctorate in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. As a former actress, Dr. Derr also earned a BA in theater arts and trained with international master teachers in Italy, India, and New York City. Her doctoral dissertation explored the impact of cultural connotations of female menstruation, wherein she analyzed the Sumerian myth known as the descent of Inanna. While completing her PhD, she also did original one-time performances on the same topic in Italy, Greece, and California. Currently, her dissertation is under contract as a book with a publisher named Inner Traditions and is pending release. Dr. Derr also provides original programming as the hostess of Journey to the Goddess TV, a YouTube channel I'll be sure to provide the link for. Finally, she is an assistant editor for the Mary Magdalene Studies Association Journal. Today, we're going to discuss her unique background in both mythology and psychology before digging into the topic of her forthcoming book, the Sumerian myth named Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld. We're going to go through this old piece of literature line by line and analyze it from the perspective of agency, or the words people use to describe emotions, feelings, and intentions. I'm excited to discuss with Dr. Derr what she talks about when she talks about mind. And the hat with our mind word of the day is the English word heart. Primarily, the word heart refers to the heart as in the physical organ that pumps blood in your body. It's usually located right above the midriff area, but heart is also used in expressions that imply centrality or the spatial center of something, such as the heart of the matter. It can be, in this sense, interchangeable with the word core. With respect to psycholinguistics, we find this word has very interesting uses when it comes to expressions involving will, volition, and emotion. For example, when you're trying to be sincere to someone, you may speak from your heart, even though your heart is actually not capable of speech. Also, in expressions where you have to decide about something related to love or maybe personal matters, you'll oftentimes see expressions like follow your heart. Finally, when you are in novel or life-threatening situations, you may describe the event such as your heart dropped or your heart sank. It's like that sinking feeling of receiving bad news. So that's the word for the day on our hat. It's the English word heart. Our book recommendation for the day is going to be The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious by Carl Gustav Jung, originally published in 1959. Jung was one of the pioneers of psychology that previously worked with Sigmund Freud. This book contains a catalog of descriptions for what Jung called archetypes. These are very important, sort of not stereotypes, but archetypes, as Jung called them, or specific kind of characters that we see recurring over and over according to mythological stories. And he also describes his concept of the collective unconscious, which I'm not going to try and summarize here. But it's very relevant to both psychology and language because the basis for a lot of these analyses are old mythological stories themselves, much like the ones we're going to be discussing today. So the book recommendation for the day is The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious by Carl Gustav Jung, originally published in 1959. Good morning, Dr. Derr. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you on this episode, and I think it's going to be a real treat for the listener because I know that you have a lot to offer based on your background in mythology and psychology and a few other topics that are also relevant to language. Could you begin our discussion by telling us a little bit about your background?
My background is in acting, actually. So I've been a professional actress since about the age of 5. And I went to New York City and I was chipping away at that career. And eventually I started to explore these spiritual longings inside of me. And at that same time, I started working with a theater group in New York City called Theater Me Too. And they travel around the world and they train with professional theater makers in their kind of traditional arts. So I went with them to India and I trained in South Indian classical dance, Mohiniyattam, which is a female dance form, Kathakali, which is probably one of the most well-known Indian dance forms. It's very kind of larger than life, and these men are wearing these large masks and big, full, bright costumes. So it was really in that experience when I literally experienced the intersection of art and spirituality, because it's really intertwined in their traditional art forms. You can't tease them out. They took us through these beautiful rituals. So it was in this experience that I started to fulfill the desire of the spiritual and the artistic, and something that I felt was probably reminiscent of what ancient Greek theater would have been like for the ancient Greeks. And because we were also dancing feminine dance forms and the goddess, there was a real experience of embodying feminine goddess energy and archetypes. And it was there that I first experienced the goddess and got to know the goddess in an embodied way. And then, of course, we were also going through cultural immersion courses as well. So the reception of goddess, not just in the dance, but in the land, in the colors, in the clothing that the women wear, the music, it was so alive and rich. And I was sitting on a beach one day in Kerala, and I was actually reading a book by Rudolf Steiner called Mary Isis Sophia. And I said, this is so powerful to experience the divine feminine in this way, but it's missing in my own cultural upbringing. Where is she? I have to find her. And so with the sincerity of that question in my heart, I went back to New York and I felt the presence of Mary Magdalene come to me. For me, this was in meditation, but the presence of her in my heart and in my mind was so strong that I kind of knew that the quest to find this missing divine feminine would be through following the trail of her. And eventually that led me to go on a self-guided Mary Magdalene tour in the south of France to all of her sites. And I got back and I was really in between trying to decide what to do next in life. And I was ready to let go of my acting career, or at least let it transform. And I knew about Pacifica Graduate Institute at that time. It had been on my radar for about 4 years, this mythological studies program. And I went into a meditation for a period of many weeks to try to, over and over, to try to find guidance as to what to do next. And I had a very profound vision of Inanna, actually. And I was familiar with Inanna because of Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, but that's about it. And in this vision, it was very clear to me that my next step to discover this missing divine feminine would be to go to mythological studies school. So it was there that I really devoted my life to learning about Mary Magdalene and the divine feminine. And I was certain that I would be on track to write my doctoral thesis on Mary Magdalene. But the truth is that the story of Inanna compelled me. And I think it compels a lot of women. To be fair, the story compels a lot of modern women who have grown up in a culture that has taught us through a lot of subliminal messaging to feel ashamed of our bodies and our sexuality. And for me, when I read the myth in totality at that specific time in my life, I really saw it as a template for women's embodied experiences. So that is pretty much my story. And then I spent the next 4 years working on this myth of Inanna and remythologizing it actually as a menstrual cycle story, because the way that I see it is that it's a template for the psychological and biological experience of being female. And in that way, I also argued that it's really important to have empowering stories that mirror women's biological experiences, and that I think that this is the perfect story to do that. Anyway, so with that, I completed my doctorate about a year and a half ago. And since then, I now have my doctoral thesis as a book under contract with Inner Traditions. So I'm really looking forward to bringing Inanna in this new way to a general audience, to women who are hungry for empowering role models. It's important to also relay that I spent as much time as I possibly could understanding Inanna within the historical context, not just going with the story as is, but trying to understand her through the Assyriology literature, because that actually gave me a much fuller picture of the complexity of the figure, and it made my remythologization of the descent of Inanna much richer as well.
Thanks for sharing that information about your background. And I just had a few comments I want to bring up and see if you had any thoughts or reactions. The first comment was, you mentioned Joseph Campbell's book, Hero of a Thousand Faces. And I think a lot of people would agree that this was a work that was very influential in the field of mythology. And the second thing I'd like to point out is the doctoral program that you went to is the only one where you can earn a PhD in mythological studies. And I think this makes your experience and your contribution really special and extremely rich because, as we all know, all of the first writings, actual formal writings, not accounting records, in every language that we know of, they're all mythological stories. And it's this genre, this literary genre, that has dominated pretty much every culture on the face of this planet. So I think that's impressive, and I'm happy to have you here. Now, I'd like to move on and learn a little bit more about Inanna. So could you just provide a little bit of background sketch about the story and maybe summarize the myth just for a reader or a listener that's unfamiliar with it and has never heard of it?
Very simply, The Descent of Inanna is a story about Inanna. She hears the call of the great below. She decides to travel down to the underworld, which is ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. And as she decides to go along, she armors herself with the 7 sacred me powers. She ensures her safe return by instructing her vizier what to do in case she doesn't return. And then she heads out for the underworld. And when she reaches the outer gates, she's confronted with Neti, the underworld gatekeeper. And basically, he is then instructed to strip away each one of these powers. And so at each of these 7 gates, he strips away one of her powers, and she is there at the threshold of the underworld naked and essentially powerless and vulnerable. At this point, too, we are told that her motive for going to the underworld is to observe the funeral rites of the Bull of Heaven, who was Ereshkigal's husband. And so she, at this point, then enters the Kur, the underworld, and it's there that she is confronted with her sister Ereshkigal. And she goes for Ereshkigal's throne. She is then seized by the underworld gods, the Inanna, and they throw at her the cry of guilt, the cry of wrath, and she is set upon her the eye of death. I prefer the language, the eye of death. Other translations say the look of death. But anyway, so it is this eye of death, the power of this death look, that arrests Inanna, and then she is finally killed. At this point, then, there's somehow the upper world becomes aware of her death. The vizier starts doing all the mourning rites, and she alerts all the father gods, like, help Inanna, we can't let her die in the underworld. And it is only her grandfather Enki who comes to her rescue. And he fashions these, the Galatur and the Kurgara, these little sexless beings, and he instructs them to enter the underworld like flies and retrieve Inanna's corpse and sprinkle on her the food of life and the water of life. So then they go down to the underworld and they meet Ereshkigal, and Ereshkigal is there. She's in this intense labor pain. Well, one of the translations says that she's in labor pain. There's another one that makes it seem as if she's already had finalized the labor and had some kind of child. Anyway, so they're there. She's in a lot of pain. She's crying out. The Galator and the Kuigara have been instructed to mirror her pain. And it's through that mirroring that she then offers to give them a gift. And they ask for Inanna's corpse. She gives it. And so they're able to fulfill their mission of retrieving Inanna's corpse, sprinkle the food and water of life on her. And as Inanna is essentially resurrected or rebirthed, she is grabbed by the underworld demons, and basically their job is to assure that somebody dies in Inanna's place, if not Inanna. So they follow her back up to the upper world, and there's a series of people that Inanna meets along the way, and they try to take her vizier, for example, in her stead. And Inanna's like, no, she was by my side. She did everything right that I asked her to do. And we go through a series of people like that. So then Inanna finally comes to her husband, Dumuzi, who is sitting on her throne. He's in all of his regalia, and he hasn't been mourning her. And she is angry, to say the least. And so she chooses him to replace her in the underworld. And she puts upon him the eye of death and the cry of wrath and the cry of guilt. And he essentially is to take her place, and he tries to hide. And anyway, the demons end up catching him. And then toward the end, Inanna is so taken by Dumuzi's sister's love and compassion for Dumuzi that Inanna agrees to allow them to alternate in the underworld. So half the year he'll be down there, the other half the year she'll be down there. And then the poem ends with actually a praise to Ereshkigal, which I find really intriguing. And I have something I would like to share about that later on.
That was a really beautiful summary for a pretty complex poem. And as we all know, the poem comes to us from southern Iraq in an area called Sumer, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the language we're dealing with is Sumerian. The writing system is cuneiform, and it's about 4,000 to 5,000 years old, at least in the oldest versions. So we're dealing with one of humanity's first pieces of literature ever. And from my understanding, also the first detailed description of what the underworld looks like. Now, could you talk a little bit about and explain what depth psychology is, and a little bit more about how that integrates with feminist studies and how that's relevant to the myth?
Yeah, I think, depth psychology is, in my opinion, it's kind of a wide field and ever growing and expanding. And Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are considered the fathers of psychology, notwithstanding some of the issues that we may have with them today. But I think what's really intriguing about their work is how integral mythology was to their creation of psychology, the field of psychology. And I can speak more to Carl Jung because I'm more familiar with his work than Freud, really looks at the way that these symbol systems are working in the background, in the unconscious, and how they connect us as human beings to one another across time and across space. And when we look at something like archetypes, for example, the way that I understand what Jung meant, and I say it that way because he's very mercurial, the way that he would describe things. Like when you go through and you're looking at the books and books of his lectures and everything that he wrote, you're like, can you just give one clear definition, please? But it's not like that, and that's okay. That's kind of what makes it mysterious and fun. So anyway, the way that I understand the archetypes is that they are universal energy patterns that are operating in the unconscious, and that they arise in different cultures in various forms, symbolic forms, whether that's, let's look at goddesses of love, for example, Aphrodite in ancient Greek, Venus in ancient Rome, Inanna in many respects in Sumer, right? And so there's these patterns, they're patterns that arise in different cultures. And I think that he was on to something in a way that is what unites us. That's how we help find our commonality with one another as humans. And so I think the main thread here with respect to mythology is the focus on the symbol systems and how symbols are maybe both a result of and producers of our meaning making facilities. Because one of the core concepts that I work with in my doctoral studies and moving forward is that there is whatever's happening in the phenomenological world, right? There's the material world that's happening. And then we use language, we use our symbol systems to try to make meaning of what's happening in the phenomenological world. And it doesn't make it right or wrong, it doesn't make it absolute, but it's just ways of meaning making. And I think that's what Carl Jung brought to life, and that's what post-Jungians have brought to life, is how do we make meaning, and why are stories so important? And why do they last the test of time?
Thanks for that brief breakdown, as well as for bringing up Carl Gustav Jung. I've read a good amount of his works, and I'm of the opinion now that he was also learning as he went along. And if you compare some of his observations and analyses early in his career, they differ in some notable ways from later in life. And I think he really nailed it by summarizing it in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, which is a book he published in 1933, which is a collection of his lectures. But I think they provide very tight summaries of a lot of the stuff that's accessible to the layman. And another note about mythology and the symbols and the patterns, I was curious about your thoughts with the following question. I do believe that mythological symbols and themes and motifs, they are completely abundant in our society, whether from a Starbucks cup, the Nike logo, or other examples we discussed earlier. But I'm also of the opinion that they may be taken for granted because they are so ubiquitous and so immersed in our life in unexpected ways. I was wondering what your thoughts and reactions would be to such a statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think you brought up two great examples, both the Starbucks cup and the Nike example. I mean, if I may share one of my own stories, there was a time when, in the middle of doctoral writing, when I was really on this trajectory where I was trying to figure out how to convey to people how important these stories and these, in my specific case, goddess archetypes are as empowering symbols for women. And I was really just feeling very discouraged. And I kept repeating this line over and over again. Nobody cares about goddesses. They just care about buying Nike shoes. And I was totally unaware of what I was saying until I was in Greece. This is back in 2019. I was sitting in a rooftop bar with a group of women at a networking event. And I, ranted the same story to these women. And in that moment, I looked over and I could see the Parthenon, Nike Athena's Parthenon, right? And I was like, oh my God. Oh my God. I was like, that's it. It's like the Nike symbol is that bridge to the past. And it's just about conveying to people that these symbols, they're not just kind of meaningless. It's not just a meaningless little swoosh, but it has a history behind it. And it has a point of view, again, that connects us to our past, but it's not just the connecting point, but it's also the memory that we have commonalities as human beings. So I think you're right that we do take it for granted and that these symbols are all around us. And I think people either choose to see it or they don't. And I think one of Jung's, at the time and place that Jung was writing in history, along with Nietzsche and these other thinkers, I think they were very worried about what they called the death of God, and basically the death of the spiritual impulse, and what would happen in a world that is devoid of spiritual meaning.
I can tell you're incredibly well read, because people who understand the work of Jung very well know very clearly you cannot understand Jung's work unless you have also read Nietzsche to a superlative degree, because he leans on a lot of what Nietzsche had to say in some of his attitudes. I think actually that's where he got the inspiration for this notion of the spiritual problem of modern man, which is, to say in his words, we have marriage, but not love. We have relatives, but not brotherhood and sisterhood. We have religion, but no spirituality, and so forth. And it leads to all sorts of societal consequences. And I'd like to ask you a little more specifically about a portion of Inanna's descent and the story as a whole in comparison to another one. So, as you're very well aware, Inanna's descent was written in Sumerian, but there's another story called The Descent of Ishtar, and another goddess that's from the Akkadian language, which is a Semitic language, different from Sumerian, from a different language family. And these stories are often kind of mixed up and molded, although there are at least 1,000 years of cultural differences between them. So could you talk a little bit about some of the differences you may have noticed between the story of Inanna's descent as well as the descent of Ishtar?
Absolutely. And I think something else that is worth noting too, that I probably should have said earlier when we were talking about the descent of Inanna, is, as far as we know, it's the first written myth that depicts descent and resurrection, and it predates the Jesus myth by 2,000 years plus, and it's a woman. And I think that's significant for women as well. And at some point too, I'd like to talk about a little bit more about the importance of myth models. But bracketing that, the story of Inanna's descent side by side with the story of Ishtar's descent is really interesting, because clearly, Ishtar's descent is heavily influenced by the Inanna story, but they're so different. One of the things that I prefer about the Ishtar version is that it's a little bit more symmetrical. So, for example, when she descends to the underworld and she's stripped of her 7 powers, at her ascent, she's given them back. I like that symmetry, but I also feel very strongly about why they're not given back to Inanna in Inanna's descent, and I can share that at some point if you'd like. I also feel like I'm trying to find the words to describe this, but Ishtar's story, it's much shorter. We've discussed that. About 140 lines, I think you told me, whereas the Inanna myth is 410, which there's an interesting inversion there. So the Inanna myth to me feels a little bit more esoteric, whereas the Ishtar story feels more like a story. And it's a lot more filled out. There's a stronger, more thorough description of the underworld. The relationships between people are a little bit more filled out, or at least the relationship between Inanna and Ereshkigal is a little bit more put together in the Ishtar version. The other interesting thing is that Ishtar's warring persona and aggression is much stronger than I would say in the Inanna version. And Ereshkigal in the Ishtar version is described as being in fear of Ishtar. That is not the case in the versions of the Inanna story that I've read. So Inanna and Ereshkigal actually feel like they've met each other's match in that way, where Ishtar feels like she's going in to dominate as a dominator. In the Ishtar version, I don't know why she's going down to the underworld. She doesn't tell us why she's going down there. So there's a lot of assumptions that we need to make. Also, the fertility piece is much more evident in the Ishtar myth, meaning that when she dies in the underworld, we're told multiple times that the copulating above ground has ceased to happen, both with the humans and the animals. I think also, for me, Inanna and Ishtar are the goddesses of erotic love and desire, kind of in that way that Aphrodite and Venus are, and that we're supposed to understand that they inspire sexuality and the male desire. And so without that kind of sexual desire and passion, if that's gone underground, then there's no desire for the male to copulate with the female. And that's what is shown in the Ishtar text. And it's always the male. And it says in the text, the male bull is not copulating with the female cow, or the male human is not copulating with the female woman. So that is apparent in the Ishtar text in a way that it's not in the Inanna text, although I do think that there is a layer of that in the Inanna text that's just not apparent.
Thanks for explaining the differences between Inanna, Ishtar, and the two texts, because I do agree with you. There are some distinct features that at least require further investigation. And you've obviously taken a look at both of these texts very closely, and you shared with me that you relied on scholarship produced by University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, as well as some of these other standard sources for doing serious research in this area as part of your book. Now, I'm interested in the psycholinguistic aspect of agency. And in the story of Inanna's Descent, there are a few critical moments where the main character makes decisions and it impacts the action and the plot. So what I'd like to do, if you're okay with it, I'd like to go through a translation of Inanna's Descent with a few important areas. And I'd like you to go through and provide your perspective on the text and maybe summarize a little bit of what's happening for the listener. And what I can do in the background is supply some translation alternatives or maybe some translation commentary just to create more options for your analyses of these passages. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
So in Inanna's Descent, the Sumerian version is about 410 lines long. And right at the beginning in lines 1 to 5, we get a sense of the beginning of the story, and we get a sense of what's happening, and we're put in Latin, it's in media res, or in the middle of things.
So the opening of the text, from the great heaven, she set her mind on the great below. So this is where we meet Inanna. She's queen of heaven and earth, but something inside of her triggers her to set her attention, her mind or her awareness, her attention to the great below.
In Sumerian, this word gets translated as mind, but as you very well know, the word I believe is gestu, which means ear. So it's she set her ear. Now, how does that impact the way you interpret her intentions?
Yeah, so we've also discussed how ear means wisdom. So the way that I interpret it is that she's looking inward for a wisdom that can't be gained from the heavens and the upper world, that she's seeking a wisdom of the great below.
So it's something to be learned.
Exactly. She's seeking to learn wisdom, the wisdoms of the Kur.
Sure. And in lines 6 through 13, we see that she abandons a lot of different offices in different locations. And just for the listener, it's difficult to explain or understand because it's unfamiliar to us. But these ancient stories were highly repetitive in almost an obnoxious way to the modern reader. So lines 6 through 13, we have a lot of repetition there. But in lines 14 through 19, it says that she took the 7 divine powers. Could you talk a little bit about what these are and what do you think their mythological significance would be?
Yeah, so she takes the 7 divine powers. They're a mixture of jewelry and like lapis lazuli beads, and there's probably some carnelian in there too. And I am hovering on that specifically because some scholars believe that they were actually gender color coded, and that carnelian is actually a color that's mostly associated with females and specifically Inanna, although sometimes she has the lapis lazuli, which is blue. But the lapis lazuli in the blue color tends to be associated with men, and especially like kingly powers. The point is that everything she takes is on purpose and it's significant. So aside from the jewelry, she also takes the crown of the steep with her, which is a queenly crown. She also takes the measuring line and the rod, which is a symbol of rulership, of kingship. And what I thought was really interesting, and I've seen a few other scholars note this, is that some of these things that she brings, the let him come, man, let him come, or let him come, and the come, man, come, are actually me's. They're emblematic of things that would be used in a bridal ritual. So when I was looking at this, I was looking at these as sacred arts of woman, of these divine powers, right? These may are the divine powers of civilization. And I was looking at them multifold. So they represent power, kingly power and queenly power, and also the marriage of the bride to the man. And they're about women's sexual allure and sexual power and the vibrancy of female power. And so I found that really interesting that she chose to armor herself in those powers on the way down.
Thanks for that insight about the seven divine powers, because we're going to have to deal with them again. And what's really impressive about your analysis of that scene is that it's not an easy passage to deal with. You have a lot going on. And this is actually confounded even more by the fact that the word powers is something that can be translated as me, or like a personal pronoun like I. But this is really strange and difficult to negotiate from a grammatical standpoint, because at other times it clearly says she took with her the seven divine I, or the seven me, even though they're different objects and articles of clothing.
I find it fascinating. And the other thing I want to bring up too, and this is like kind of a cross mythic comparison in the myth labeled Inanna and the God of Wisdom. She obtains the me from Enki. And of those me, she obtains descent to the underworld and ascent to the underworld. And I assume in this myth that she has those in her possession because she also has these seven me with her. And I think what the Enki myth is trying to tell us is that she obtains all of them from him at that time. And so one of the questions that I ask is, why doesn't she bring those me with her down to the underworld? Why is it these specific seven powers?
So moving on to lines 20 and onward, see that she places these items on her body and she describes them pretty carefully. And getting to line 32, it's clarified that she will descend to the underworld, and she gives instructions to her vizier to help save her in case she doesn't come back. And starting in line 37, there are specific warning instructions such as lacerate your eyes, lacerate your nose, lacerate your ears, and also instructions to do something in private. What do you make of these clear instructions to cause physical damage to oneself as a part of mourning?
One of the things I was reminded of recently in some literature I was reading is that traditionally in many of these cultures, and I believe it was the same in Mesopotamia, that women would have been the primary mourners, as like that would have been like their professional job. Obviously, Inanna's vizier, as far as I understand it, is also woman-like, feminine, if her Sukal can be that. And so looking at the specifics of the eyes and the nose, I think it might have to do something with what we've discussed earlier about the power of different organs in the Sumerian worldview, that the eyes are active. The nose, I'm sure, I haven't come across it because I haven't looked for it, but I'm sure that the nose has a certain active role as well. And especially the power of the eye, whether it's the life-giving eye or the death-giving eye. I mean, I think it might have something to do with altering the power of these body parts.
Inanna's vizier, Ninkubura, is mentioned several times, and this person is given specific instructions. And later in the story, as we'll get to, Inanna says, "You cannot take my vizier in place of me for the underworld." Instead, she provides her husband, according to one version of the ending. So what do you make of the relationship between Inanna and the vizier?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen different explanations. I'm kind of convinced by the idea that the Sukal might be like her supra persona. Diane Wolkstein suggested that Inanna's vizier specifically might be related to Inanna's celestial aspect as Venus, because her vizier's name means, now correct me if I'm wrong, means Queen of the East. And so I thought that was an interesting connection. But I really kind of see the vizier as a supra persona. They're like separate identities, but they're not. It's like a version of her that can act on her behalf.
Absolutely. And if you look at it from a textual standpoint, full trust and faith is given to this person. And as we move here through lines 41 to 48, 57 to 64, we see Inanna going to great lengths to explain, if this person doesn't help you, then go to this person. And you really get this notion of planning as if Inanna understands or knows ahead of time what's going to happen. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. She knows exactly what's going to happen, in my personal opinion. In my opinion, yeah. And it's almost as if she asks her vizier to go to the other two gods first, Enlil and then Nana, almost as a matter of respect first. But I think she also understands that Enki is the only one that is able to do anything. Because as I understand it, water is the primary generative substance in Mesopotamian worldview, like it is in many mythological systems. And the sign for water is also the sign for seminal fluids and urine. Is that correct?
Yes, I have a lot more to share in agreement with you, but go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
Okay, great. And since Enki, for example, is shown in many myths, impregnating rivers and fertilizing the land through his water/seminal fluids, I think that we're to understand Enki as kind of the magician, and one of the original owners of the Me, the sacred Me powers, is the only one that has the ability to provide the generative substance. The way that I understand things is that Inanna specifically, but all the female goddesses, don't actually possess the generative substance, that the Mesopotamians understood that human life came through males' seminal fluids and impregnated the female. And in this way, like the ancient Greeks, the woman provided the matter. In her womb, she provided the forming substance of the child. And so I think that factors in pretty significantly in my interpretation, and in my interpretation of how the Mesopotamians might have believed, because Inanna can't regenerate herself, but Enki can, because he has the fertilizing power, the water fertilizing power, which is also, we should remember, seminal fluids.
That's extremely interesting insight that I've never even considered or thought of, but it makes a lot of sense with respect to everything I know about it. So, for example, you mentioned that water was a very important concept of giving life to everybody. And this extends to no matter which angle you want to look at Sumer. For example, the biggest invention that the Sumerians had was the concept of irrigation, to be able to control water. And if you look at archaeological reports done from the early 1900s, you'll see that these were very advanced systems. And this creeps over into mythology as well, because if the water didn't come, then the people would starve. But if too much water came, then the people would also starve because the plants would die. So there was also a concept of a balance that needed to be held. And if you look at some of the other older Sumerian stories, an early one is called the Song of the Hoe. And of course, the word hoe is used as a backhoe, kind of like a sickle. And these are farming instruments to dig for irrigation. And they would worship these instruments as being necessary to produce or continue their way of life. I think from everything that you've shared and from a linguistic standpoint and other parts, I think these aren't just random coincidences. I think they're quite relevant.
Something else I'd like to share briefly too is that the reader is supposed to understand, and the Mesopotamians probably knew this, again in my interpretation, that the underworld was not a fertile place. It was dry, it was dusty, they ate clay for their food. In the Ishtar version, Ereshkigal talks about drinking muddy water. And I think we're supposed to understand that it doesn't have any inherent fertility, which is why when people die, they're not reborn. Like in other traditions, there might be reincarnation. No, they go to the underworld and they die because there's no regenerative capacity in the underworld. And that is why it's essential that Inanna devises a plan for Enki to bring the fertilizing regenerative power to the underworld on her behalf.
Moving to line 65, where it says, Father Enki, the Lord of great wisdom, knows about the life-giving plant and the life-giving water. He's the one who will restore me to life. You've already discussed in a little length about your interpretation on that. I was wondering what you had to say about this. This phrase, Father Enki, Lord of great wisdom, but the literal translation is Lord of wide ears. The notion of justu, the ear, is mentioned again. What do you make of this in light of the fact that we don't really use this expression in English? How do you take this?
Well, I think you could look at it a few different ways. I mean, the wisdom is between the two ears. We might talk about that today as our brain, because we see our brain as the source of our whole consciousness, everything, and our intellect. So it could mean something like that. But I think the culture is also trying to speak to is that there is a wisdom in your ability to listen and hear, and not just the words between people, but Julia Sante. She suggests that the listening is actually an inner capacity to hear the divine wisdom of the gods. So I think that that's what it's really pointing to, is the ability to hear in a way that's not just the little words, but the meaning and the substance of something.
So past that, we get Inanna getting to the Netherworld, and she gets to the gatekeeper, as you've described, Neti. And when all of her items are described, you get down to line 114. This message is then passed to Inanna's sister. And according to this translation by the ETCSL, it says that she bit her lip and took the words to heart. She then instructed the doorman to let her in. How do you interpret this very critical passage and this reaction of Inanna's sister to her showing up with these divine powers?
I just want to talk about the word heart for a minute. Heart can mean inside, correct? That those are interchangeable. And the way that I read Gwendolyn Like's work is she described that there is a linguistic parallel to the womb, that in some cases the heart can be likened to the womb.
I think you're absolutely right.
And a colleague of mine who was born and raised in the Hindu traditions and is reads Sanskrit and everything, she had told me there's a similar relationship in Sanskrit between heart and womb. So in that respect, I took a lot of liberties to reinterpret this to mean that there's a sense of like a womb wisdom. That aside, I think that this is a passage that shows Ereshkigal's vulnerability. It gives us a little taste of their relationship. I think it also shows her desire to be in relationship with Inanna. And I think she's unsure of why Inanna's coming, even though Inanna has given a stated reason. There's no sense that Inanna has ever tried to be in relationship with Ereshkigal prior to this moment. And I've interpreted it as, Ereshkigal feeling abandoned by Inanna. So I think this is a moment of Ereshkigal being willing to see how her relationship with Inanna could be different.
Going back to what you said about the word heart and how it can be used. So this is actually one of our hats that we displayed a while back. It's the SHA-2 symbol, and it can mean like center, core. So we can translate that line in 114. She bit her lip and took the words to core, or to the very essence of a person. So I think this supports your interpretation. And as we go through the next few lines, we get to line 164 to 172. And Inanna was forced, as you described earlier, was removed of her clothes, and she's laying down. But in this scene, Inanna causes her sister to rise from her throne, and then Inanna is sitting on the throne. And then in this vivid action, the notion of the eye of death is given to Inanna, and she's seemingly killed. Could you talk about this scene in what some would call the denouement, or the climax of the whole story?
In my interpretation, Inanna has to come to the underworld completely vulnerable and without her upper world powers, because the upper world powers are the kind of life sustaining powers. They're the life erotic powers. It's like that those upper world powers that she brings with her are like those floating devices, and they keep her above land. But without them, she's then able to experience the death and dismemberment of the powers of the Kur. And so, because I believe, too, in my interpretation, that Inanna is intentionally going to the underworld to learn the chthonic powers that exist in the underworld, that she wants to die. And this is why she has set Enki up to prepare her for her rebirth, that there is a wisdom in death that Inanna is looking to obtain. And so because of that, she knows that the quickest way to her death is to act as if she's trying to seize the throne from her sister. That she knows in making that action, everyone around her will look at it as if she's trying to usurp the throne. Now, that goes against what most people say about this scene. So most people are saying that Inanna wants to, be queen of heaven, earth, and the underworld, and literally take the throne from Ereshkigal. That makes sense from a purely textual reading, but like I said, I'm looking at many, many different layers that's looking at their relationship, and also the metaphysical powers that Inanna is looking to understand. And the way that I look at the Eye of Death specifically is as if like a mask, like a Gorgonian kind of mask. And it's like looking through these eyes is the process of looking beyond death. And for me, beyond death is non-dual consciousness. So this is where it starts to get very, like, again, metaphysical.
These are really great debates that you're having all throughout the world, whether scholars from Germany, from University of Chicago, where I attended, University of Pennsylvania, UCLA, they're all slugging it out in these journal articles, fighting for what's the right interpretation, if it even exists. It's an answerable question. So there is no scholarly consensus on this. And I think what you've provided here is very much in line with the facts from a linguistic standpoint, as I understand them. And the second thing I'd like to add, I think your interpretation is value added, and I'll tell you why. As an interdisciplinary scholar, you add a very important layer of analysis by studying the relationships between people and what drives human behavior. And with great respect, this is oftentimes very absent from ancient studies. So I think what you have to share about this matter, from whether from a linguistic standpoint or from a mythological standpoint, is incredibly valuable, and it's worthy for other people to hear. And with that being said, I'd love to hear about your interpretations of, in that previous scene, about the guilt and the speech.
I think what happens to, again, in my interpretation, to beings, gods, humans, whatever, the demons, like, because the underworld has become a place that's death and decay and it's sterile. So it's almost like the demons and the gods that inhabit that place are just like calcified and angry, and there's no life down there. So all that can arise are these calcified attitudes and these anger and this lashing out. And it's more of a psychological take than anything else. Mythologically speaking, it may have something to do with just what the Sumerians thought would happen at the end of life, right? That they would be judged by a certain set of underworld gods, and all of their sins, even though sin is a Christian concept and not a Mesopotamian concept, but the things that they did wrong that they might need to atone for are shown to them at this point. And there are two things that I think about every time I come to this scene. One is, I listen to a lot of people discuss their near-death experiences, and they have this like life review. And this is almost like the life review, except when near-death experiencers talk about their life review, they're not usually being beaten like this or being made to feel bad and guilty. The other thing is, it reminds me of a passage in the Gospel of Mary, which is attributed to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And there's a section of that in which she describes the ascent of the soul, and it's like wrath and craving and all of these like very base, what we would call negative human experiences are like she's interacting and dialoguing with them, or the soul is as it's trying to ascend. And they're like, we didn't see you ascend. And she was like, that's because I gave up my craving. And so there's some kind of commonality in what's happening here, even though it's a descent with the ascent in the Gospel of Mary.
And we should also make it clear to the listener that this isn't a fully fleshed out story. It's a compilation of over 50 cuneiform artifacts or clay tablets, and some of them are horribly broken. Some of them, there aren't even clear timelines or paperwork for where they were located. So doing the work of figuring out what this means and being brave enough to stand behind interpretation with evidence, it's not a simple business, not at all. Now, as we go through the rest of the story, Inanna's vizier provides the necessary substances and follows the steps to get her back to life. But in line 263, you start seeing more mention of these organs when Ereshkigal is being described as going through certain sensations, such as the hair on her head is bunched up, her holy shoulders, her nails, and talks about her heart and her liver, clearly in a troubled state. What do you make of these anatomical references, and how do you understand them from your unique perspective and background?
Well, again, at this point, the text that I follow has her in the midst of childbirth, which is, again, an interesting dynamic where we have the juxtaposition of death and birth together with Inanna's corpse and Ereshkigal's birthing. To me, it seems like very obvious that what she's really talking about is the womb as she's like going through birthing and the pain that comes through birthing, even the great joy that will come on the other side of birth. Liver specifically, I mean, in Chinese medicine, the liver is the seat of anger, or that's where a lot of anger is held. So I think what's happening is her awareness, there's the biological awareness of the organ, but there's like a release in feeling as well. So I think the significance actually is the way that her pain is mirrored by the sexless beings, the Kugara and the Galatur, that it's through them mirroring back to her the physical and the emotional pain that she's in that she actually finds redemption, again, defined like to use a Christian word. The witnessing of her pain is a mirror for her, that so she feels like she can be seen and heard for the first time in her, likely for the first time and maybe the last time in her life. And there's no empathy in the underworld, and these beings are giving it to her so that she is able to then finish her birthing process. It's like the constriction and the contractions of pain and anger and this inability to birth something new, whether physical or metaphysical, is only able to happen through the witnessing of her pain. And she's able to soften and allow the cycle of rebirth to occur, or birth or rebirth.
As we go along towards the end of the story, we see that Inanna has to make another choice, a very important choice, about with whom to side, whether it's to give her vizier back to take her place in the Netherworld or another individual. What do you make of the fact, as we're told in a controversial ending, that she trades her husband? What does this version of the ending tell you about the story and what's going on from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, I have to admit, I really align with what Wilkstein says here. Again, my interpretation is that Inanna went down to learn the death, decaying chthonic powers, and I interpret them as feminine powers of death and rebirth, and they have psychological and somatic meanings. From the psychological perspective, when you see depth psychologists talk about this myth, they're looking at the suppressed dark feminine, like the wild, chaotic, angry, uncivilized, if you will, undomesticated side of woman that has been so suppressed in Western society. And that this myth invites women into the possibility of reintegrating that side of herself into her persona. And I think there's a wisdom to that dark feminine Ereshkigal that's not just psychosymbolic, but there's powers associated with that as well. And what Wolkstein suggests is that it's not just women that need to come home to themselves in this way, but men need to experience the wild chthonic side of femininity as well. And so she suggests that he is sent down there as kind of a representative for all men to then understand that side of the feminine. And in that respect, feminine and masculine reside in all beings and in all nature, right? So it's not only that women need to reclaim that feminine side of themselves, but men need to understand it too. And that's why Dumuzi is sent down.
I want to come back to the 2 points that you said you'd like to come back to. And the first one has to do with this ending right in line 411, which says, Holy Ereshkigal, sweet is your praise. What are your thoughts or reactions to this final line in this one version of the ending?
I recently read that someone suggested that the fact that this poem ends praising Ereshkigal means that this poem is actually about Ereshkigal. And she argued that in a lot of these literatures where you see maybe gods competing against this, that, or the other, when the poem ends praising one of those gods or the other, it's an indicator that it's about that god. It's so easy to think that this poem is about Inanna, but it's just as much about Ereshkigal too.
That's a really interesting interpretation. Now that I think about it more, I guess those are very strong lines of evidence that you've put that the story has as much to do with her as it does to Inanna. And just the second thing that you said you want to come back to was you want to talk for a little bit about myth models, if I remember correctly.
Right. And I touched on this earlier, but I just think it's really important to mention someone who's really influential in the way that I kind of interpret myth. And her name was Rita M. Gross, and she was a Buddhist scholar and a feminist, so a feminist scholar of Buddhist traditions. And she would talk about the difference between women's history and feminists approaching religion, and that from the kind of feminist philosophical tradition, it's really important for women to have mythic role models, whether they are rediscovered from the past, like actual historical figures or actual like goddess figures, or invented. It doesn't matter if they're real or invented, but the presence of or the lack of female role models in a tradition is actually telling women within that tradition about their value within that community, how they are valued. Having a lack of female mythic role models, or mere models, she calls them myth models, is actually to the detriment of women and men. So that is the genesis of my own journey. That is the genesis for many women who have grown up in monotheistic traditions that have a lack of divine feminine imagery. And so Inanna provides that for a lot of women, as I mentioned earlier. And that is why she's the goddess zeitgeist of the moment. And there are many books I've seen, even within the last year, that are being published on Inanna.
Inanna is definitely a very influential and important figure that's gaining a lot of steam. And of course, the scholarship that you're doing, your wonderful work in your doctoral dissertation, as well as your upcoming book, I'm sure are going to be very valuable and credible contributions to this field as a whole. So thank you so much, Dr. Derr, for taking the time to come out and speak with me about this important poem.
Thank you, Boban. I'm really appreciative to have been here and been a part of this discussion with you.